for many, many businesses, if you pair solar with storage, you can have your own on-site energy system that is cost competitive with purchasing from your utility. Often it's actually cheaper. You can save money, as well as taking some power back. Now you've got options. And if you're an operator that runs hundreds of facilities, it's not to say that you deploy solar and storage at every one of them on day one. But as you start to do that, what you find is that you've got choices about whether or not you do things with your utility or not. So just closing your eyes and holding your breath and going for a swim is not the only thing that's on the radar.
Welcome back to another episode of Renewable Rides. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by my colleague, co-founder, Calvin Fine. Gareth is on the road today, so you'll have Calvin and I, but we are really going to be digging into how procurement teams think about energy and how the evolving energy landscape is really changing how businesses have relationships with their utilities and what some of the options are. Calvin, you've been on a couple previous episodes, but in the context of procurement, maybe you can remind our listeners your background and kind of where you've been over the last couple decades.
Well, first and foremost, Dan, great to be back. Thanks for having me on again.
Of course.
And yeah, so spent probably the better part of 20 years working in procurement, supply chain, broadly getting the most out of the money that you spend as a business with other businesses to help you to get things done. I've done that across consumer products, heavy industry, public infrastructure. I'm Australian. I'm based out of Australia. I've done that here, throughout North and South America, a little bit of Africa, and a little bit of Asia as well. So I've been lucky to do that sort of thing around the world. And yeah, I'm passionate about procurement. I think that companies that work well with their suppliers and strategically are thoughtful about how they approach relationships with their suppliers have so much to gain. There's so much competitive advantage to be had. So it's a big part of what we like about the energy market and building these sorts of things with VECKTA. So yeah, let's dig into how procurement teams think about energy and how they think about power supply and all those sorts of good topics.
Certainly. Well, Calvin, as you know, many of our listeners are trying to drive the energy transition within their respective businesses or drive sustainability and decarbonization, and energy is increasingly a part of that conversation. But I think first, let's help those that are not in procurement or not on the capital allocation committees, help them understand a little bit more about how procurement teams think about their different supply relationships, their partners, and some of the buckets that they fall into.
Yeah, sounds good. I thought I'd bring with me. This is a little bit of a management consulting topic, but a concept in procurement strategy that's really well known. It's been around since the 80s, called the Krylik matrix. So this is a way that procurement teams classify different categories of spend so that you can think about what are the most appropriate tactics to get the best value out of the money that you're spending. There are plenty of things that we spend money on in business that are very transactional. It's the pens and pencils and the buckets and shovels that you're using on your agricultural property, where really all you're trying to do is just make life easy. You go to Staples and you press the easy button, because the best thing to do is not think about those things very hard. And then you have really heavy strategic relationships, the things where you're very dependent on your suppliers and your suppliers are very dependent on you. If you are Dell and you're thinking about putting CPUs into your laptops, you're really dependent on Intel. But at the same time, Intel, if they want to sell CPUs, they're really dependent on Dell. Those businesses have to work really hard together to get the best out of that relationship, and they'll be working very hard. They'll have large teams involved on both sides in how to work best together. The other spaces that you see are bottlenecks for folks. If we're talking about chips, this is something like what happened to the auto industry in recent history, where chips to automakers, most of the time, they're not something they would ever have thought very hard about, because in the total cost buildup of a $100,000 truck, that maybe the chips cost $5. It's such an inconsequentially small part of the total cost buildup that they probably don't think that hard about those sorts of things. If you'd asked somebody 10 years ago, then what they found was, oh no, there's a shortage. We don't have enough chips, and all of a sudden we can't ship cars. So they did all of a sudden become a real bottleneck for those companies. And if they were clever about it, if they'd planned it in the right way, you can recognize those kinds of patterns in the market before the supply crunch actually happens. And you saw it in the auto industry. Some automakers were more heavily impacted by those chip shortages than others. And then the last category, and this is kind of the most classic procurement space, is products and services where you spend a lot of money on them. You have a lot of power to exert on the market, and there are many different supply choices. And this is the stuff that procurement teams typically love. They bundle it up in an RFP. They get proposals. They drive prices down. They leverage their spend in the market to, get to the most competitive, high-value outcome. I think the watch out for folks who are not used to dealing with procurement teams is that that's the stuff that's often high visibility, and you think that when you go and talk to your procurement colleagues, what they're going to want to do with everything is put it in an RFP, smash the suppliers on cost, and get to something that's a really low cost outcome. And for some categories of spend, that is the best tactic. For other categories, it's not. That's not what Dell are doing to Intel, for example, because it just wouldn't work. And I think the interesting thing we can dig into today is, where does energy procurement sit in the tactics space for procurement teams, and how's that been evolving over the last 5 or 10 years?
Well, I appreciate this. And as we were talking about it, this was a new matrix for me, and we'll certainly include the visual of the matrix in the show notes. Where has energy sat within this for different companies? And maybe we can use two kind of different examples. Maybe a manufacturing firm that's in a kind of in the greater part of a metro area, but it's in a well populated, well covered place. And then somewhere where you've spent quite a bit of your career in the mining space, because it might be a little different for those considerations. And I think it's valuable for our listeners to hear how some of those decisions are made when the cards are very different.
Yeah, sounds good. That's really demand side focused. So let's talk about the demand side first, and then let's talk about the supply side a little bit as well. So how utilities think about their customers, or how you can anticipate that they do. Anyway, so on the demand side, if you're a pretty typical grid-connected customer of electricity, your demand, that what you're buying from the utility is a very, very small part of the total electricity that they're selling. And very typically, you're going to be on a tariff, and you might have a choice. You can pick that you're on tariff A, B, or C. That's something that the utility offers, and that will change a little bit based on what voltage you take service at and how much electricity you're consuming. But largely, it's price listed, and you just pay the list price. You can't really go back to them and say, "Hey, I'd like the tariff to have a little bit more of these charges and a little bit less of those." They're going to say, "Thank you very much, Mr. Fine. Appreciate your inquiry. Here are the tariffs that are available to you, and I encourage you to choose one of them." And that's pretty much the end of the conversation. Like that, and that's okay as an outcome for a business. You've got to get electricity. You just buy it from them. You know what the price is going to be, and historically, that's kind of worked okay. I think the thing that's really tough for businesses is everybody's watching those prices go up by 4 to 7% year on year. If you'd started this conversation 20 years ago, many businesses would look at electricity and say, hey, this is 1 or 2% of my total cost of operating the business. I'm treating it like the pens and pencils. I'm treating it like the buckets and shovels. The best thing to do is just to not think about this, because we've got more important things to do in our business. We're just going to run with what's available. We're going to pay the bill at the end of the month, and we're going to feel pretty good about it. To contrast that against heavy industry, I spent the better part of a decade in the mining industry. If you're contemplating building a new mine, whether it's coal or copper or iron or whatever it is that you might be thinking about, these things are typically not located where utility companies are already established. And you have a choice. You're either building hundreds of kilometers of very expensive high voltage transmission lines to connect into existing energy supply, or you're building your own power supply. Those types of projects are typically tens to most of the time hundreds of millions of dollars of investment just in the power supply. And if you're thinking about a project right after you figure out, hey, there's enough copper in the ground that it's worth digging this stuff out and we can sell it to people and we can potentially make some money from it, very close to the next top on the list is, well, where are we going to get the energy to run this thing? And how are we going to get security of energy supply? That's the way big businesses, like big remote businesses, have thought about this forever. That's always had to be the case. And it's interesting that sort of thinking is now starting to filter down to, we've got a customer at the moment who's a cold storage company in the Central Valley in California. And they write into, it's what you do, you send a letter to their energy supplier, the local utility, and the local utility says, well, if you want electricity from us, maybe it's going to cost you more than $10 million in upgrades, and you might have to wait for, more than 2 years for us to get around to doing the work. How do you feel about that? And all of a sudden, you're forced to start thinking about this a lot more like a mining company than you are thinking about it like pens and pencils.
And I think that even for companies that are at facilities they've been at for many years, as their operations change, they're going to run into this issue as well. We're seeing it with companies that are electrifying their operations, that are electrifying their transportation, and getting access to that power can be a challenge. I've been having conversations with folks within the data center space and hearing that there are some utilities out there, especially in the high concentration of data centers, Northern Virginia being one of them, where there's starting to be mandates from the utilities saying that any new applications for service will just simply not be taken. We're going to grandfather all those that are in, but we're not taking any more right now because we just simply cannot keep up. So it is shifting the conversation. So Calvin, where has within that matrix that you talked about, where has energy, not in the mining sense, but in the maybe more traditional sense of what our listeners are experiencing, where has energy and the relationship with the utility sat? And then as prices have gone up and reliability has gone down, where is it shifting?
If we take a little bit of a historical perspective, for a long time, electricity was really just something that you took the rate, you knew what the price was. There wasn't a lot of procurement thought put into it because there isn't a lot of choice. If you go back 10 years, you did have the option to build solar or to commission backup diesel generators for outages, but those things were, so in the case of diesel generators, not particularly an economic choice. You really did it because you needed to have a backup to make sure that your refrigerators were kept cold, or that if you're a hospital, your patients are kept safe. And you could build solar as an economic type of choice. the solar switches off the moment that the grid switches off. It can't run or do anything independently. So really what you did was close your eyes and say okay, because you just didn't have a lot of choice. You had to accept the price that was being requested. And what we've seen over the past decade is utility rates accelerating much more quickly than the general rate of inflation. So for businesses, utility as a percentage of their total outgoing expenses have increased. And they start to go from, the 1 or 2% where you just ignore it and it's not worth spending the effort on it, to now we're at 5 or 10 or 20 or more percent of the cost of running your business. And all of a sudden, now we've got to start paying attention to these sorts of things. Add on to that the pressures that many companies have faced around greenhouse gas emissions and energy being a large contributor to that. So there's more scrutiny from other sources, more than just purely cost, that procurement teams are being asked to think about as well. And energy comes, above the visibility threshold, and now businesses are paying a lot more attention to it. In the absence of some new technology, unfortunately, what that would have meant for businesses is, even though you don't like it and the price is expensive and there's a lot of carbon emissions associated with it, what you've got to do is, close your eyes and hold your breath and go for a swim anyway, because that's all that you can really do. There hasn't historically been a lot of choices. I think what's the thing that's really changed with that is, for commercial and industrial applications, battery energy storage systems becoming an economically viable alternative. So now, for many, many businesses, if you pair solar with storage, you can have your own on-site energy system that is cost competitive with purchasing from your utility. Often it's actually cheaper. You can save money, as well as taking some power back. Now you've got options. And if you're an operator that runs hundreds of facilities, it's not to say that you deploy solar and storage at every one of them on day one. But as you start to do that, what you find is that you've got choices about whether or not you do things with your utility or not. So just closing your eyes and holding your breath and going for a swim is not the only thing that's on the radar. And that's really exciting for businesses all over the place to be able to take advantage of that and take some power back in those relationships. Let me circle back to something we touched on earlier on, Dan, which is there's the demand side of how do customers think about electricity. There's also the supply side of how utilities think about their customers. And one of the things that utilities have as part of their business model is that they supply tens to hundreds of thousands to millions of customers. And even if you're a very, very large customer, the reality is you're going to be a fraction of a percent of the total energy that your particular utility is supplying to anybody. You can see it in the language that utilities use to talk about their customers. They don't call them customers, they call them ratepayers. And they're used to you having to, again, close your eyes and hold your breath and go for a swim in their waters, because they know that's the only choice you've got. So for them, there isn't really a lot of incentive to go and work with their customers in any meaningful way, because there are so many of them. There's plenty of good progressive utilities who'd love to do this kind of stuff. It's not to say that all of these people are, terrible people that don't like you as a customer. It's that they have millions of customers. And it's very challenging to provide personalized service to millions of customers, so they don't. You don't have a lot of choice there. You don't have a lot of enthusiasm from the other side.
Yeah, and I'd say energy procurement as a craft or a profession is not new, and there's a lot of people out there working within large organizations that do this within retail markets. But even then, you're selecting from one grid supplier to another. And what we're talking about here is an alternative to the grid supplied electricity. And I will say, I mean, we're starting to see some utilities that are looking at distributed generation and how they support clients in doing so, but it's very early days. And so I think the exciting thing is understanding how historically energy has been in your matrix that we talked about before, a bottleneck item where you need to make sure that you have supply, and if it goes out, it's a big problem. Into more of a strategic item when you start to think about alternatives to the grid, and even within those deregulated markets or retail markets, maybe it was a bit of a leverage item because you had a bunch of potential suppliers, but now you've got an alternative where you can supply your own. And it's not to say that you're going to go completely off grid. I think it's an evolving relationship from a consumer relationship, a one-way relationship, more into a prosumer relationship where you can actually start to feed energy back onto the grid for the utility to use elsewhere, and you can take signals from the utility. I mean, I here in California, we've been going through a heat wave the last couple of days, and I'm part of a kind of more of a residential Ohm Connect program where it asks me to reduce my consumption. So it's a bit of a demand response program, and I think we're starting to see more of that with commercial industrial customers. But you have to have on-site energy assets, largely, unless you want to shut down your operations, to be able to participate. So how do you think procurement teams or those that are trying to influence procurement teams should be thinking about this new dynamic?
I think the really powerful thing about on-site energy, to your point, is that you shift the conversation about energy from being something that's a bottleneck where you really can't do very much. You're a price taker. Or you're a price taker in deregulated areas amongst several suppliers, but you're really just taking a price, to something that's much more of a strategic conversation where you have options and you have choices. So this makes it far more interesting from a procurement perspective. Like those are the sorts of opportunities and roles that are really exciting, and you can do some really innovative things in helping to drive great value for your business. So procurement teams are excited about this kind of thing. And frankly, they don't come along very often, where something that used to be a pretty cut and dried part of the business becomes something that's much more dynamic and has much more capacity to create great value outcomes for the business more broadly. So I think what a lot of people will find is that your procurement colleagues are far more interested in this and far more thoughtful about how you might take it on than what you might anticipate, or what you might see from folks who are used to dealing with procurement teams that are working in categories that they'd view more as a leverage drive value outcomes type of space. We were talking about chips earlier on, so I'll give you an example of like what does this look like as an evolving relationship from something that's been in the news over the last little while. If you were Dell and you were reliant on Intel, you're a price taker, you're in that kind of bottleneck space. And one of the biggest things that's happened in the computer chip world in the last little while is Apple getting out of that bottleneck dependent relationship on chip makers. And they took a big step of developing their own chips. And they've done that. Probably that was in the skunk works at Apple for the better part of a decade, maybe longer. I don't know the internal history of it, that they've been thinking about and developing and iterating on how can we take more ownership and control of this and switch it to much more of a strategic conversation. And they did, and the Apple Silicon's been a huge hit. And they've done really, really well out of it. But you can imagine when they started, it wasn't that they walked into the office at Intel at some stage on a day and said, sorry, that's it, guys, we're cutting the relationship. It's over. We're not talking to you ever again. They've steadily introduced this. And you can imagine the conversations that have happened between two companies with a very rich history and a very long partnership, about how does this change the way that things are evolving. And for Apple, the amount of relationship power that they've taken back just by doing a little thing right at the start was enormous. And, great work by them. That's evolved over time to the point where they're now almost entirely or maybe even completely using their own product. But it didn't start there. It started with, we're going to take some power back. We're going to do a few little things. We're going to test the waters, and we're going to make sure that we can deliver on this. And I think that every business can do that with energy. You can take some power back from the utility. You can give yourself some strategic optionality where you can decide to use utilities to purchase your electricity where they're better, where they're able to supply really great service, where the costs are low and the supply is reliable, and it hits the carbon emission reduction objectives that you've got. And where it doesn't, now you can do your own thing. And probably you're not cutting the cord to the utility in most cases in the first instance. You're not saying goodbye, see you later, we're never talking to you ever again. What you're doing is saying, I'm taking some agency here, and we have now got a more balanced relationship where you're not so important to me anymore. So now we can have a more nuanced conversation, and I don't just have to, when you jump, I say how high. And I think that's such a seismic shift in what has been a very fixed model of engagement for a very, very long time.
Yeah, 100%. And I think an example explicitly related to this, similar to what you just described with Apple, there's a aerospace manufacturer that has a facility here in Southern California. We'll eventually have a member of their team who really led this initiative here on the podcast, but they're within SoCal Edison territory, and we're looking for ways to have more reliable, cheaper power. And they ended up deploying a hybrid system across CHP, so combined heat and power, because they have a lot of thermal loads within their manufacturing process, a relatively large solar array, parking lot solar array. They now have covered parking for their employees, and a pretty sizable battery energy storage system. And largely, they're going to be off grid. They're not going to be completely off grid. They're not going to cut the cord, but they're going to be self-reliant and largely use the grid as backup. And they are going to be overproducing some solar at times that they're going to feed back into the grid, where SoCal Edison can use that with other customers, and they're glad to take that and glad to pay for some of that power. But to your point, it's dramatically shifting the relationship that they're having with that local utility into one where they're controlling more of the dynamic and using them if their system goes down or they need to go down for a period of time for maintenance. And it's just giving them that much more sovereignty and ability to control their costs, operate the risks that come with energy, and take matters into their own hand.
Yeah, beautiful. I love it. I think that's what everybody should be doing.
Completely agree. Well, Calvin, I really appreciate you coming on today. I think this has been a really helpful discussion as we think through, where do our relationship with the utility sit? It's been a question I've constantly asked myself, where within the procurement world, where, when you look at all of your many different suppliers, can you look at one that is in a lot of respects, not everywhere, but in many places, delivering an inferior product, a less reliable product, lower quality product? Even if outages aren't a concern, we've heard with many manufacturers that just even dips or sags in energy can really impact their manufacturing processes. So a lower quality product at a higher price, aren't the procurement teams going to be digging into that and looking for alternatives? And historically, as we talked about, there hasn't really been alternatives. And now over the last couple of years, it's really starting to shift. So any parting thoughts for our listeners?
Your procurement teams are some of your greatest allies in getting after these kinds of things. I love having conversations with procurement professionals about how to get after these kinds of opportunities. I just say, don't be afraid to get them involved, and don't be afraid to engage them early. These are smart, hardworking people who want to see the best out of your dollars of spend. And they're going to be huge allies in helping anyone who's looking to drive energy outcomes for your business to make the best decisions and get really good things done.
Love it. Thank you, Calvin. And really appreciate the time. Anybody that has any questions about this, feel free to reach out to us. We can get you directly in touch with Calvin. And looking forward to having you on the podcast again soon, Calvin.
Thanks for having me back. Thanks to all the listeners, and I'll speak to you again soon.
See ya.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.